So we've looked at some very basic styling. What we're going to do now is we're going to create another element, which I'll explain what it is, its sort of purpose. We'll then look at styling this element. So we'll go through a few CSS properties that you can use, and you'll get the hang of how you can actually style specific elements. And then we'll actually style elements within that element. So essentially what we'll be doing is nesting elements, which will then mean we can look at more ways to select using CSS. So let's create this element first of all, and this is going to be a div element. Now div stands for divider, but you can pretty much use it for, there's nothing wrong with using a div. There are, say, elements that are more tailored to certain things. So, for example, an article element houses an article. A paragraph houses a paragraph. You wouldn't necessarily use a div like this and then maybe put some text inside of there. That wouldn't make much sense. You would use a paragraph element for this. Now, a div would usually be used for something that you wanted to generically contain. So I'm going to basically create a box on a page. Now this could be anything. It could be a box that contains a little bit of information. And in actual fact, we are going to put a paragraph element within this div element. And then we'll look at how we can style that. So this div element here then, we're going to give something called a class. Now, a class is basically a pointer to a specific style that you want to apply. And you have to be careful when you are naming classes. You have to be careful with reusability within code. You want to write your CSS as efficiently as possible. We're not going to be diving into that too much because that tends to go into topics like object-oriented CSS or different patterns that you can use within CSS to write your CSS. So instead, throughout the series, we're going to look at very basic examples like a class of box. Now, if we just get rid of this line quickly, previously we created a paragraph element. And within that, we put some text. Now, we styled this using the P selector. So this is an element selector. We're selecting an element. But how do we know if, say, we have two elements of the same type? How do we know which one to target? Well, in this case, because we've applied a class of box, we can actually use something called a class selector. So we say dot for a class selector, and then it's the name of the selector. So it's box. And then we do exactly the same thing as before. So now what we can do is within this block, we can apply styles to this box. So let me just write box inside of here, and then over in main.css, let me give this a background color of black. And let's give this a foreground color of white. So black is 000 in hex, white is FFF. It's actually 6 of them, but we can shorten these to 3. Same with if you were doing sort of like a grey, like that. So we've got a black background color, and we've got a foreground color. So let's take a look at this in the browser. There we go. Now one thing you'll notice, this has stretched the entire width of the page. And this is because this element is a block level element. Now basically what that means is a block level element will expand in terms of its width to the entire width of its parent container. Now what's the parent container of this box? Well, that's the body element here. That's a container, technically, it's an element. So it's stretching the entire width of the body. If, for example, and we wouldn't do this, there's no way we would do this, setting the width of the body to a certain size, we're going to set this to say 300 pixels. Now there are different units of measuring within CSS, but in this tutorial really we're going to focus on pixels and percentages rather than ems and rems, just because this is an introduction. So I've set the body element to have a width of 300 pixels. So what's now going to happen is, because this box is a block level element, because it's a div, by default it's a block level element, this will only be 300 pixels wide. But we wouldn't do this. We wouldn't set a width on the body. At least I can't think of any reason why we would do this. So how do we control the width of the box? Well, that's simple. We've already seen the width rule. So we can do width 300 pixels. We could do height 300 pixels if we wanted to. So we've already learnt a few more CSS elements just from doing this. Now, that's pretty much all we really want to do for now. What we're now going to do is focus on a couple of more ways we can use CSS selectors. Now, let's say you were going to have 10, 15, 20 boxes on a page. I don't know, they could be images, image containers, anything. You might want to set styles for any element within this, or say you were expecting to always have a paragraph element within this box. What you could do is in here, now we're going to pull this down and create a paragraph element. The reason we're pulling this down is because this is a block level element, so that's why we are indenting this. You would rarely see something like that. It looks a little bit messy. It helps if you pull this down. So inside here, let's put some text. And let's go over and refresh. And there we go. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the box has sort of come away a little bit from the top. You can see, we won't inspect it just yet, but we can see that's come away from the top a little bit. We'll deal with this in a moment. But I want to target within any box a paragraph element. So how do I do this? Well, we could do P like that, and then we could say color red, for example. But what we're actually now doing is we're targeting all paragraph elements. So for example, outside of this box, if we had some text in there, that would also be red, which is what we don't want. We don't want this. We only want paragraphs within the box to be red. So what we do is we say any child, or descendant rather, of box, which is a P element, gets these styles. So we're saying any paragraph within any box, we want the color to be red. There we go. We get the same style, but when we create a paragraph element down here with ellipsum inside of it, we just get normal black text like that. Fairly straightforward. We've targeted only the paragraphs within this box. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's come on a little bit to responsive web design, because this is really, really important. We're not fully looking at responsive web design here because it would require probably a whole other series. But let's look at what happens here when we increase the box width a little bit. So let's double it actually, and we'll see we have this. So when I pull my browser in, and I'm sort of simulating a smaller device or perhaps a computer that has a smaller resolution, you can see that we've got this, we're having to scroll along here like so. So what's actually happening here is, because it's a fixed width, the browser isn't honouring that, and it's not decreasing the size of this element to sort of handle that or to cope with that. So what we tend to do is we tend to give a width of 100% to any element we want to sort of be responsive. Now, that will then wrap the text in it. You can see that we don't get any scroll bars along the bottom. Now, the reason that the paragraph element wraps like this is because it just contains text. Let's get rid of this, for example, and just create a paragraph element here, and let's create some lorem ipsum inside that. You can see that already by default this responds down nicely, like so. So back to our example of our box, what's actually going to happen is on a device like a mobile phone or a tablet, what it's going to do is it's going to automatically assume that this isn't a responsive site, and it's going to try and render this in the best way possible. So we want to combat that by adding a viewport meta tag and then giving a little bit of information about the width of the page and the initial scale. So let's do that in here. So let's create a, just up here we can do this, a meta. We're going to say name viewport, and in here we're going to say content. Width is the device width, and here we're going to say initial scale 1.0. So this basically tells us that the width of the content is basically matches, if you like, the device width. We won't see any difference on the desktop, but if you were to say view this on your phone, you might sort of want to put this on Dropbox, or you might want to send it to yourself in an email. Since we're not using a web server here, it's hard to view it via a web browser. You can send this to yourself and have a look at it on your mobile phone, and you should see this look actually quite nice, rather than on a mobile phone view without that meta viewport tag. You might see the actual rendering of it look like that, and then you'll have to pinch in to your phone to actually see this. So that's just a little taster of how we might responsively design this container. We could also do something like the following: width 100%, and then we might say maximum width, and this will, as the name implies, give a maximum width to something. So we could return to this 600 pixel width that we actually want. But now what's going to happen, because the width is set to 100%, but the maximum width is 600, there's no minimum width set. So what we can actually do is we can, as we get just to the edge of the element, you can see that starts to come in. So we get the size that we want, but as we come in, the size of the element's made smaller. So let's take this one step further, and let's get rid of our box example, and let's get rid of all the stars that we've done so far, and let's create a div with a class of container. So usually when you visit a website, you have some kind of wrapper to the website, some kind of container. So we're going to try and emulate that now. So this is my website, for example. So at the moment we don't have any stars associated with this, we just see the text, this is my website. So what we're now going to do is we're going to center this container. So we'll look at how we can center this element, and then we'll look at the responsive kind of thing that we've just looked at, where we do 100% width and then a maximum width on the same element. So under main.css, let's create a class selector for container. And let's set a background on this, so a background color of, say, I don't know, 555. Let's make it 999. Like so. In fact, no, let's make it F0, 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 which is a sort of grey color. So there we go. In fact, let's make it a little bit darker, just in case the contrast can't see that. Okay, so what we want to do now is we want to set a width to this container. We're going to set a width of 100% on this. And then we're going to set a maximum width of, say, 960 pixels. Now what this is going to do is it's going to do exactly the same thing as before, whereas when we pull it in, that responds in, and then we get the container fill up just the viewport that it's within. But now what we're going to do is I'm going to say margin left auto, margin right auto. Now we've not looked at the box model yet. That's in the next video. We're going to be looking at the box model, which is a little bit complicated to explain, but once you've got the hang of it, it's fairly obvious. But what this is going to do is, because margin left and margin right are set to auto, probably the best way I can explain this is it almost gets confused. So the left is auto and the right is also auto. So where does the container end up? Well, it ends up in the middle. So it effectively centers. So now as we pull the container in, you see that there's equal amount of space on the left and the right hand side. But as we get in, the container shrinks. Cool. So if we were to, inside of here, create some more text. Well, let's create 4 paragraph elements, and I don't know, let's create just 1 paragraph element, I guess, with some lorem ipsum. And there we go. So we can see that respond a little bit better. You can see that the height of the container now gets smaller to accommodate for the amount of text in there. And if you were wondering what this was, I'm actually using a plugin for Sublime called Emmet. And what this does is allows you to enter there's various things that you can do, but say the name of the element and hit tab, and that creates the element for you. So I could create 4 elements of paragraph. We can do all sorts of things. I wouldn't recommend you get it as a beginner, but once you start getting a little bit more advanced and want to start speeding up your workflow, it's probably a good idea to get something like that. So we've now looked at creating a very basic container. It's entirely responsive. We've added our viewport meta tag, which will allow our smaller devices to render this as best as possible. Next, we're going to take a look at the box model, which is talking about sort of paddings and margins, and we'll look at the common problems we have when we add margins and padding to elements, and we'll look at the difference between padding and margin.